Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Our topic for this webinar is Sea Level Rise, a Grid Submerged, and we have guest speakers with us from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And our webinar today is a presentation of Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, and our host for this webinar is Seth Mullendort. Seth is a project manager here at Clean Energy Group. And before we get started, I'd like to go over just a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants today are in listen-only mode. This means that you can hear us, but we cannot hear you. So you have a few options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can use your computer's mic and speakers, or you can call in using your telephone. And there are some instructions on your screen and on your webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. And we will be reading your questions as they come in. We will be queuing them up, and we will have a Q&A with our presenters at the end of the webinar. We'll get to as many questions as we can, so please don't wait till the end to type your questions in. Type them in as you think of them. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of our previous Resilient Power Project webinars, on our website at the web addresses that you see on your screen. And with that, I will pass this over to our host, Seth Mullendort.
Sam, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I just want to give you a little bit of background about who we are here at Clean Energy Group. Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit that works towards the advancement of clean, renewable energy. It works on advancing technology, policy, and innovation in order to get more of these projects done. We also have a sister organization called the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a coalition of state and municipal energy funds working towards bringing more clean energy to their respective areas. And the webinar today is brought to you by the Resilient Power Project, which is a project that is a joint partnership between the Clean Energy Group and Meridian Institute. It is generously funded by the JPB Foundation, Kresge Foundation, and CERTA Foundation. And let me just tell you a little bit about what the Resilient Power Project is. Resilient Power Project, if you could go to the next slide, Sam. It is working towards bringing more reliable power to vulnerable communities in times of need, when there are disaster strikes or when there are outages for various reasons. So part of the project, we're increasing public awareness of the need for resilient power and the availability of alternative technologies to traditional diesel generators that tend to fail in emergencies. Generally, the projects that we are supporting are solar and storage projects, solar PV and battery storage, sometimes with small CHP units. So we work with state and city officials in order to advance policies and work on incentive programs. We also have a specific focus on low-income and vulnerable communities, such as affordable housing and the critical public facilities that support those communities. We're working with a number of different levels in addition to policymakers. We're also working with developers themselves and companies that provide energy storage and solar systems. We, through our project and through our funding from foundations, we do have a small technical assistance fund that we can help support the pre-development costs of some of these projects to do the initial feasibility work and scoping that's involved in getting these projects done. We have done a lot of webinars like this, around this, in addition to a number of reports, which you see some of those below. You can find all of these on our website, along with a lot of other information at resilient-power.org. And so this webinar today is the last in a series of 3 that we're bringing to people around the 3rd anniversary of Hurricane Sandy. The last one last week was around our report, Resilience for Free, which is our latest report that just came out about solar and storage and resiliency in affordable housing units. Today's speakers come from Union of Concerned Scientists, and they just recently released a report called Lights Out, Storm Surge, Blackouts, and How Clean Energy Can Help. That's available in the handouts on your webinar dashboard, and also available, of course, on the Union of Concerned Scientists website. So we have two great speakers. This is a great report. I highly recommend going to check it out. So we have Steve Clemmer and Julie McNamara with us today. And Steve is the Director of Energy Research for Union of Concerned Scientists Climate and Energy Program. He conducts research on the economic and environmental benefits of implementing renewable energy technologies and policies at the state and national levels. He also directs research on coal, natural gas, and nuclear power, and on solutions to reduce carbon emissions and water use in the electricity sector. He also serves on the steering committee of the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative. Before joining UCS, he was the Energy Policy Coordinator for the Wisconsin Energy Office. And we're also joined here today by Julie McNamara, and she is a Energy Research Associate in the Climate and Energy Program at UCS. And she specializes in analyzing state, regional, and national level policies relating to clean energy development and deployment. Prior to UCS, she worked as a research assistant for the program on emerging technologies at MIT, where she developed proactive and adaptive risk management policies for the field of synthetic biology. She also previously spent several years as an environmental scientist at Eastern Research Group, which is an environmental and public policy consulting firm serving primarily federal agencies such as the EPA, DOE, and OSHA. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve and Julie, and we will have a little bit of time afterwards for some questions. And as Sam said, I encourage people to submit questions as we go along, and we'll get to them in order at the end. So thank you.
Thanks, Seth, and to the Clean Energy Group for inviting us to speak today about our new report. We really appreciate all the great work that the Clean Energy Group is doing around this topic, and much of it has been incorporated into our analysis and our report. Today, during this presentation, I'm going to start by highlighting some of the impacts that we've experienced from recent storm surge and coastal flooding from recent storms. Then I'm going to pass it on to Julie to talk about our mapping analysis that we did, and then she's going to hand it back to me to close to talk about some of the key solutions for making the grid more resilient and to help keep the lights on. Superstorm Sandy was a big wake-up call for the Northeast when it made landfall near Atlantic City, New Jersey on October 29, 2012. In addition to the tragic loss of lives and property, Sandy caused billions of dollars of damages and left more than 8 million people in 21 states without power. On the third anniversary of Sandy, this new analysis that we did looks at what steps have been taken to make our electricity grid less vulnerable and more resilient to power outages from storm surge and coastal flooding on the East and Gulf Coasts. The answer? Some progress is made, but the investments are not yet up to the scale of the problem. Sandy shut down or damaged at least 165 electricity substations, several large power plants, over 7,000 transformers, and 15,000 electrical poles were damaged. Storm surge and flooding were major contributors to this damage and the subsequent outages, as you can see reflected in the devastation from this picture. And Sandy really isn't an isolated incident. Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma in 2005 and Gustav and Ike in 2008 also wreaked havoc on the grid in the Southeast and Gulf Coast states. Each of those storms knocked out power to between 1 and 3 million customers and damaged 200 to 500 substations, according to data from the U.S. Department of Energy. As global warming pushes sea levels higher, the risk of coastal flooding from storm surge grows. This poses a serious and worsening threat to the electricity infrastructure that supplies power to more than 70 million people that live along the East and Gulf Coasts. Despite our growing reliance on electricity, our grid is becoming increasingly susceptible to failure due to old age and poor condition. And as a result, the rate of outages from severe weather has been steadily rising over the past 15 years. This chart is based on data from the Department of Energy that tracks major electric disturbance events through Form OE417. Utilities are required to submit information about those events and how many customers were affected by outages. Notably, the vast majority of the incidents resulting in customer outages occur because of severe weather, which you can see in the blue lines in that chart. You can also see some of the spikes that were caused by some of the major hurricanes that have happened over the last 10 years. The number of billion-dollar weather-related disasters has also been on the rise since 1980. After adjusting for inflation, 178 weather and climate disasters have resulted in total damages reaching and more commonly exceeding the $1 billion threshold. Together, all of these events combined have costs exceeding $1 trillion. The damages caused by storm surge are mostly covered under severe storms and tropical cyclones, which you can see in the blue and pink bars in this chart. But these categories also include costs due to wind damage and other factors, so it's not a perfect indicator for storm surge. The category that's listed as flooding, which is shown in the light blue bar, is actually related to events that are mainly caused by extreme precipitation and not storm surge. The impacts of these outages from storm surge and coastal flooding can be very devastating. For communities that are hit by these severe coastal storms, the devastation doesn't end when the skies clear and the floodwaters retreat. As demonstrated by Hurricanes Sandy and Katrina, lack of electricity after these events can be another and separate disaster. For example, during Sandy, as shown in this picture, the NYU Langone Medical Center lost power and its backup generator systems failed, which forced the evacuation and relocation of hundreds of patients. Some populations, including the elderly and those with disabled and those with low income, are particularly challenged by power outages and struggle to cope with their impacts. Now I'm going to pass it over to Julie and have her talk about the results from our mapping analysis.
After Steve spoke about some of the devastating impacts we can see, we decided to take a look, do an analysis of what causes these widespread outages, and more, what can we do about it? How can we incentivize the stakeholders to take action? So here we have a schematic of the centralized grid. I think we all know that losing a power plant means trouble for the grid. If you're not making power, you're not getting power. But major substations shown in the step-up and step-down transformers are also critical nodes, and they allow electricity to get from the power plants to the end users. And the grid's designed to be able to handle the loss of one or two major generators or substations, but once you lose more than a couple, you can experience widespread outages. So here we have pictures of power plants and substations really hammering home that they're vulnerable to flooding. First, with power plants, it's not as common for them to be inundated, but it's certainly not without precedent. You see the top left corner, that's the A.B. Patterson plant in the New Orleans region following Hurricane Katrina. It was inundated in 6 feet of water. That, along with 6 other units totaling more than 900, or approximately 900 megawatts of generating capacity, were sufficiently damaged as to not be able to come back online for quite some time after the storm had passed. Now with substations, you can see that these chain link fences just don't always get the job done in terms of holding back floodwaters. These are from a range of storms that have knocked out power. So once a substation is flooded, if it's inundated and the equipment hasn't been completely lost and failed, the repairs still take upwards of a week per substation, as you have to break down each piece, clean it, dry it, and reassemble it. Now, if the equipment has been fully damaged, it can take upwards of a year for some of these major substations, cost of over $1 million to get new ones back online. So we chose to take a look at both power plants and substations, not just because they're such important elements to our ability to keep the electric grid going, but also because they can be vulnerable to flooding, and they can also be made less vulnerable. So they makes them a prime target for decision makers' action. So what did we do for this analysis? On the left side, you can see a map from the recent quadrennial energy review overlaid with the 5 sites we looked at. This shows storm tracks from 1980 to present for all billion-dollar hurricanes. It's pretty readily apparent that no part of the East or Gulf Coast is really immune. So we spread our sites of analysis all across the region. And we specifically were looking at storm surge. So on the right, you can see a schematic of 15-foot surge, and that means a wall of water that's associated with a coastal storm event. We weren't looking at compound flooding events, which means the precipitation that also comes along with storms like this, or the wind that comes along with them as well. So we modeled the threat of storm surge using the SLOSH model, which is a tool from the National Weather Service. That lets us look at, they use a hurricane's category strength to determine the severity of surge. And we use the MOM, the maximum of maximums, for the SLOSH model. So we were able to look at something of a worst case scenario, where we see the high water mark, essentially, the extent of any given storm of that category, what type of flooding we could see. We were also able to determine the depth from that model. But finally, because we're not just talking about the threats that utilities are facing today, but also what they should be doing to be more proactive in the face of climate change, we added in sea level rise. So we used the intermediate high scenario from the 2014 National Climate Assessment and layered in based on Climate Central's work, where we can get localized sea level rise projections, which take into account various local changes to the sea level rate, including especially subsidence. And we looked at what would happen to these storm surge findings if we added in projected sea level rise in 2030, 2050, and 2070. Now, there are some limitations to this approach. For one thing, we can only say whether the location where a power plant or substation is located is exposed to flooding, not whether or not that substation or power plant would definitively go out. We don't know for each one if it's been elevated or if they've implemented submersible equipment or the like. We also can't tell, related to that, but also because of the way that the grid could be designed with redundancies in place, whether or not widespread power losses could occur. There could be additional redundancies built in. However, once you start seeing the widespread exposure, you can see that the likelihood is absolutely there. And finally, as I had mentioned earlier, we don't look at potential wind damage or additional flooding from precipitation, like with Hurricane Joaquin. A few weeks back, there was minimal surge, but quite extensive precipitation and flooding that ensued. So in some ways, this is a more conservative assessment of what a severe storm could bring. So now I'll dive into our findings. So we looked at 5 different sites along the East and Gulf Coast. For this first site, the Delaware Valley, I'll take a little bit more time to kind of explain what we have here. In our analysis, we show 2 maps and a bar chart. We show the extent over time. So how far inland can storm surge go in 2012, and then 2030, 2050, and 2070. The circles represent power plants, and the triangles represent substations. The power plant data is a mix of EIA and SNL data, and substations come from Platts. If for the substations that are pink, it means that they could have been inundated by 2070, and the green shows power plants the same. So in the Delaware Valley, you'll notice that you don't see too much change in extent. There's not too much darker orange. That's related to the topography here in particular, along with several other factors. But you'll notice in the next map, the depth does increase over time. So if you picture something of a bathtub, the height of water can keep increasing while the extent may not grow so much. And in these findings, still, even with the change in extent being somewhat small in this region, we do see an increase between now and 2050 of 5 major substations potentially becoming exposed. So in this map, we see the depth of inundation. This one shows year 2050. We do have additional maps online where we show the change in depth over time for all years. So we see here, also along the bottom, a bar chart that shows for each 2012, 2030, 2050, and 2070, the changing distribution of substation inundation over time. So if you see that there are increasingly higher numbers of substations inundated in the deeper 10 to 15 and 15 to 20 foot range. Here in southeastern Virginia, one of the big takeaways is there's a lot of concentrated electricity infrastructure, and there's a lot at risk, including 15 of the 18 major substations in Norfolk and 9 of the 11 major substations in Hampton, and that's today. But between now and 2050, we see an additional 13 major substations that could face floodwater depths of 5 to 10 feet deep, and an additional 3 could be exposed to depths of 10 to 15 feet. Now, Dominion Virginia Power, the primary utility in the region, has initiated a $500 million decade-long effort to upgrade and harden its substations, although the emphasis right now is more on the physical security, such as including video cameras and safety fences, as opposed to a serious dialogue on climate change. Here in the South Carolina Low Country, we see that by 2050, 7 power plants could be exposed to flooding, including 4 at a depth of 5 to 10 feet and 1 at a depth of 10 to 15 feet. Especially if you look in the Charleston region, 2/3 of the 59 potentially exposed substations by 2050 are projected to be inundated by more than water. Here in southeastern Florida, you get a strong sense for the growth and extent of surge as sea level rise is incorporated over time. In fact, from a number of about just under 40 substations today, that number doubles in exposure to just by 2050 and more than triples by 2070. Another takeaway is if you look in the bottom right below Homestead, there's a large power plant. That's Turkey Point, a nuclear plant, and while that is not projected to be exposed to flooding, some of the area substations around it are, and based on the centralized grid structure, you can still see major outages even if the power plant doesn't go out. Finally, we have the Central Gulf Coast, and here you see a little bit of a different map. In the areas that are slightly cloudy, that represents where levees are in place and different flood protection mechanisms. We wanted to show this because although levees are used and can provide protection, they are not infallible, and we did show, based on our analysis, that certain storms could still overtop these levees or run around them. So substations and power plants are still potentially at risk. And with that, I think I will pass it back to you, Steve.
Great. Thanks a lot, Julie. So now I'm going to talk about some of the best ways we can help reduce power outages and help keep the lights on. These solutions fall into 2 broad categories. The first is adapting or hardening the grid to prepare for storm surge and a future with higher sea levels. Julie's already touched on a few of those. The second is some of the mitigation options that can both increase the resilience of the grid and reduce global warming emissions to help avoid some of the worst consequences of climate change and reduce the severity of these impacts over time. Hopefully it's not going to advance 2 slides here. Okay, so the The typical response by utilities to extreme weather events has been to invest in so-called hardening measures. In the report, we separate these into three broader strategies of protect, accommodate, and retreat. So protect means adding protective defenses such as seawalls, dunes, wetlands, or other artificial and natural barriers around coastal power plants and substations. For example, the picture in the upper left-hand corner shows two nuclear plants co-located next to each other, Hope Creek and Salem, on the Delaware River that showed up as being exposed in our analysis, and how protective measures could be adopted to reduce the vulnerability there. But you can see that that site is fairly well exposed and would be difficult to completely protect. Accommodate means modifying newer existing infrastructure to operate in the presence of water, so that could include elevating substations, installing submersible equipment, or protecting underground power lines from saltwater intrusion, as shown in some of these other pictures. Finally, retreat means retiring or relocating the at-risk infrastructure when it's too expensive or could be technically infeasible to fix it. It also means limiting the construction of new investments in coastal areas that are prone to storm surge and flooding. While some level of hardening is necessary, these measures are often very expensive and may not be the most cost-effective long-term solution. For example, a 2011 study by Entergy found that it would cost at least $15 billion over a 20-year period to harden the electric utility systems along, that it operates along the Gulf Coast. When the power does go out, critical facilities in our communities, such as hospitals, water and wastewater treatment plants, community shelters, police and fire, are forced to rely on backup systems until the main grid can be restored. Traditionally, this has meant a reliance on diesel generators for use as backup power. However, these systems present a host of reliability and implementation challenges. This includes things like a failure to operate when they're called upon as a result of being rarely used or due to insufficient maintenance. So in New York, during Sandy, an estimated 50 to 60% of the backup generators were reported to have failed during that event. It can also be difficult to secure fuel supplies during and after severe storms. As shown in the picture, employees of a software company in New York City helped carry buckets of diesel fuel up 17 flights of stairs to a generator on the roof of their lower Manhattan building that was flooded by Sandy. The main fuel tank for the generator was located in the basement of the building, and that was contaminated by salt water from Sandy's storm surge. Some of the other problems of these backup generators are that they're noisy and they can cause high levels of pollution, including carbon emissions. And they also, their usefulness is really limited to power outages, which can greatly reduce their overall cost effectiveness. In contrast, we talk about several clean energy technologies that can be an attractive alternative to make the grid more resilient and reduce carbon emissions. For example, renewable energy sources such as solar and wind, if coupled with batteries or other energy storage systems, can provide electricity even when the sun sets, the wind stops blowing, or the centralized grid goes dark. When it's not an emergency, these technologies also generate valuable clean electricity for everyday use, which makes them more cost-effective in that way. The report highlights several case studies of states that are making significant investments in renewables to help make the grid more resilient. For example, in the top left picture shows Florida's SunSmart e-Shelters program, which has supported the installation of more than 115 solar photovoltaic and battery systems at schools that double as emergency shelters during extreme weather events that are located around the state. The Florida Energy Center has also used these installations to help educate students and teachers about the technology and preparing for natural disasters. The picture in the upper right, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Make It Right project helped rebuild some of the city's homes with solar panels and energy efficiency measures to help lower electricity bills. Unfortunately, that program was fairly limited in its scope. After Hurricane Sandy, several power plants were damaged, as we've been discussing, that caused widespread outages. But in Atlantic City, New Jersey, the picture on the bottom right, the wind turbines that are located at this wastewater treatment plant didn't suffer any damage. They're actually shut down because the winds were so high, and that's something that does happen with wind turbines that are designed to do that so they don't destroy themselves. But after the storm passed, they were capable of producing power. It's worth noting that these systems may not help homes and businesses that are directly hit and experience the most flooding and damage from these events, just because of the overall devastation that sometimes occurs from these. However, they can help the many other nearby customers that aren't flooded but experience outages from these events. But these systems also need special inverters and other types of equipment to be able to operate when the rest of the grid goes down. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. The good news is that the cost of wind and solar has fallen by about 60 to 70% since 2009, while the cost of battery storage is also declining. Several recent reports by the Clean Energy Group, some of the ones that Seth showed earlier, such as the Resilience for Free report, show how solar with storage systems can be cost effective in some locations today and how they can be financed for use in multifamily and low-income buildings. The chart on the upper right shows the decline in solar costs, and during that time frame, the installed capacity of solar in the U.S. has expanded by a factor of 15. The bottom left shows that the cost of wind power has declined by about 66% since 2009, and the best sites in the U.S. are now cheaper than new coal plants and competitive with new natural gas power plants. The light blue line shows the sort of average cost of projects in the Northeast. It's slightly higher than the U.S. average, but it follows the same trend, and those costs are coming down over time. In the cost reductions and the innovations that have resulted from low wind speed turbines have also made it economic to develop wind in new areas of the U.S., particularly the Southeast, which has shown little, somewhat limited development to date. Combined heat and power plants are another promising technology that can greatly increase fuel efficiency while supplying both heat and power to critical facilities. For example, sewage treatment plants naturally generate a lot of methane, and that can be used as a fuel source for CHP projects. This is a picture of a facility in Bergen County Utilities Authority in a 2.8 megawatt facility adjacent to its water pollution control facility in Little Ferry, New Jersey, that generates enough electricity to meet approximately 85% of the facility's electric load. The system also generates heat for the building and heat for the sludge digester system. When Hurricane Sandy hit in 2012, this facility continued to operate without issue, unlike many of its counterparts, which were forced to dump raw or partially treated sewage into area waterways. By reducing electricity demand, energy efficiency measures can also defer or eliminate the need to build new power plants and other infrastructure. And having less infrastructure means that there's less equipment vulnerable to climate-related risks. An example of implementing efficiency related to resilience, after Sandy, the New York Public Service Commission required Con Edison to reduce peak demand through efficiency, demand management, and distributed generation that allowed the utility to delay construction of a $1 billion substation by at least 10 years. You may have heard a lot of hype about smart grids and microgrids. Microgrids provide a potential solution to incorporate many of these distributed energy technologies into self-contained systems that generate and consume all the energy within a compact geographical island, or they can be interconnected with the broader grid and choose when to shift into island mode. As illustrated in this graphic, microgrids really represent a family of advanced electronic and communication technologies, including sensors, processors, distributed generation storage, demand-side management, all of the things that I just talked about, that can control and isolate disturbances on the transmission and distribution system. Massachusetts has an interesting program in place, a $40 million program that is funding not only microgrids, but the rest of the technologies that I've talked about, targeted at supplying backup power to municipal facilities, emergency shelters, police and fire departments, and the like. And so there's many other projects too that we talk about in the report, but that's an interesting one that's sort of going after all the different technologies I'm talking about. So power plants representing the largest source of U.S. global warming emissions at over a third of the total. Because of this, the electricity sector really has a vital role to play in solving the problem. It also has a vital role in the sense that the impacts that we've been talking about directly affect the sector, and in terms of planning investments that might last for 40 to 60 years, we really need to be thinking ahead about not only technologies that will help make us more resilient, but will also help reduce emissions over time to help reduce the future costs and impacts of climate change. So finally, we have three sort of main categories of recommendations in the report. One of those is talking about better preparing and protecting the grid from current and future impacts. Utilities and regulators should take action to help protect the infrastructure that's at risk from coastal flooding today and ensure that those investments incorporate the context of climate change over the life of those decisions, most importantly sea level rise, as we talk about in this analysis. And some of those actions would include developing vulnerability assessments, taking into account the current FEMA standards for planning around a 100-year flood are retrospective in nature and based on historical data and don't take into account sea level rise. And so we're encouraging utilities as well as state and local decision makers to plan for that and adjust their standards accordingly. Increasing the resilience of communities by the strategic deployment of distributed power, resilient power solutions. As part of this, regulators, utilities that propose these investments are going to need cost recovery for them to go forward. So there needs to be a balance in terms of between the hardening and mitigation measures and allowing utilities to recover their costs for prudent investments. And federal and state agencies also to fund some of these projects, as I highlighted in some of the examples that I just went over, and also prioritizing some of those investments to some of the vulnerable populations that are impacted the most by these events. And finally, we talk about the need to adopt strong policies to reduce carbon emissions, and this would include things like supporting strong state and federal carbon standards. Currently, the EPA released the Clean Power Plan in August, and that's an important step in terms of reducing emissions from the power sector, in which some of these investments can be made to help achieve the state emission reduction targets. Adopting and strengthening renewable energy and energy efficiency standards is another option. Most Northeast states have these in place and have pretty strong policies in place, but most of the Southeast and Gulf Coast states don't. And so that's another area where they could help incentivize some of these strategies. So with that, I am going to close, and I guess we can open it up to questions. And I just wanted, on this last slide, to thank some of the support we got from a few foundations, including the Common Sense Fund and the Hewlett Foundation, for this work.
Okay, great. Thank you, Steve and Julie. So we have a few questions that have come in, and it looks like we have plenty of time to address them right now. If anybody has any other questions, please do submit them at this time. So, Steve, you talked about microgrids a little bit as one of the measures that can be taken to change the way the system works in the face of these. Can you just speak a little bit more about what you think the relative value of microgrids are, and what a microgrid needs to have and be able to adequately provide backup power in the face of storm surges and other types of disasters?
Yeah, so I think some of the value that they can provide that is, sort of the target of many of these state programs that I talked about is really to help provide power for critical facilities that need to have access to power during extreme weather events and during times when they have outages. So, police and fire, hospitals and things like that are definitely, water and wastewater treatment plants and the like are definitely an important area to focus some of those efforts. And, I think compared to the loss, the economic losses, but also the loss of lives and so forth, can help justify some of those investments. But they may not make sense, everywhere. They're not going to necessarily be deployed everywhere to solve, to completely eliminate outages. But they can be helpful in some situations. And, even, as I said, there's some specialized equipment that needs to be added for them to work and to be able to disconnect from the centralized grid into island. And, it is possible to design systems as well for homes and businesses, individual homes and businesses, to do that as well, that are not necessarily a microgrid, but allowing them to still have power during these outage events. So those are just a couple of examples.
Okay, great, thanks. So there was the example of the wastewater treatment plant that had the wind turbines there that were able to weather the storm and keep providing power once the winds have died down. Have there been any studies that you're aware of that have looked at the impacts of storms, such as hurricane, on renewable energy sources, both, I guess, how they perform in those instances and how they are able to weather those storms?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any sort of real extensive studies on it. Most of what I've seen has been anecdotal information. And, as I mentioned, in the case of the Atlantic City project, for example, those wind turbines were, after the storm passed, were operational and capable of producing power, but, they're interconnected to the grid, so if the grid goes down, they may not actually be able to supply power to that facility unless they have some of the specialized equipment that allows them to keep operating and isolate them from those broader outages. The same is true for solar projects. I mean, if your house is, if you have a solar PV panels on your roof, but your house is completely devastated by the storm surge, which did happen in a lot of cases in places like New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut, then they're not going to help you. But as I said, if you're located nearby but are experiencing outages from the event, they could be a helpful solution for you. But I'm not aware of any sort of comprehensive studies that have been done that have analyzed their performance during or after these events.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and of course, as you note in the report and here, having more distributed energy resources, which tend to be renewable sources, it certainly provides a more resilient grid. So there's not one centralized location that can go off and knock down a larger area if there's more distributed and widely dispersed resources like renewables.
Yeah, and I think it's more likely to be the case that you would be able to locate solar, for example, on site than you would be able to do wind turbines, for example. But there are several examples of wind projects that have been co-located near municipal facilities, so it can work. It's just it's more often the case that you have larger wind projects that are located further away from load that may not be available to help during these types of events if the transmission system is down.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Just a quick question: in your wind and solar costs that you showed those graphs, do those costs include the ITC?
For solar, the chart showed the installed cost of solar without the ITC, and the wind chart showed the sort of all-in levelized cost of electricity for generating electricity from wind projects, and that chart would have the effects of the PTC included in there, but it's included for every year, so if you took it out, the cost would be higher, but the trends that are shown in that chart would still hold true.
Okay, great. So what were the sea level rise assumptions that you used for this report? Was it a consistent depth increase or rise per year, or were there certain models that you looked at as far as sea level rise predictions for the future years?
Julie, you want to take that one? It looks like we might have lost Julie. Well, I'll take a crack at it. So as Julie said, we used the intermediate high projection from the 2014 National Climate Assessment, and then we sort of were able to localize that using information from Climate Central. And the impact, or the amount of sea level rise was basically, depending on which site you're at in the 5 sites that we looked at, was somewhere in between 1 to 2 feet by 2050 and 2 to 3 feet by 2070. And so what was the other part of that question, Seth? Am I missing part of the question?
No, I don't think so. I was just wondering if if it was based on an incremental value over years, but you were looking at intermediate projections. Is that right?
Yeah, Julie, are you there? Okay. I guess not. So, like I said, it was the intermediate high projection, so it was more of a mid-range projection. It wasn't a worst case projection. So I'm not sure, but you can look in the report. We talk about it in more detail, and we show what the levels are for each of the 5 sites.
Great. So yeah, if Julie hops back on, maybe she can provide more detail on that. But we'll move on. So related to sea level rise, with the changes in climate and global warming, flooding is predicted to become a more frequent problem and more severe as well. So have you done any looking at estimates for 100-year floods and 50-year floods, and how those are going to affect substations and generators? Is that research that you guys are looking into as well?
Well, I mean, some of that was taken into account in terms of the modeling that we did, in terms of analyzing different categories of hurricanes. And in the report, most of the impacts are described around Category 3, and so that looks at a certain level of storm surge from, as Julie described, from the National Weather Service SWOSH model. When you add sea level rise onto that over time, it means that storm surge reaches further inland and the depths of the flooding increase. So we looked at it in that way. In terms of the 100-year flooding, I mean, that's essentially the standard that most utilities and actually just most coastal infrastructure is built to, based on the FEMA flood hazard zones. And as I said, or Julie might have said on the call, that we see that as being a fairly weak standard, especially because it doesn't take into account sea level rise over time. So areas that might show up as at moderate risk currently to flooding in the future might actually be a much higher risk because of adding in sea level rise. So we think it is really important to do vulnerability assessments that look at higher standards and more severe storms, to, let's say, 500-year flooding standards.
And do you find, I don't know if you came across this in your research, are utilities being proactive at all and then in going above and beyond what the current standards are, or is it the case that the standards are going to need to change in order to force them to take into account more severe events?
Julie, are you on yet?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, we can hear you now.
All right, there we go. A great job fielding all these, Steve. So I think some utilities, especially those that have been following Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey, we've started to see proactive behavior, whether or not that's solely being because they were prodded by the public service commissions in their areas. It's definitely a two-way street. Now, we would say that it's very important to make sure that we're not just saying wholesale investment in resilience initiatives, right? Because you need to be prudent about it. As Steve said in the adaptation slides, that some of these are very expensive and the payoff may not be worth it. So making sure that both, if the utilities are moving forward with resilience investments, that they're doing so in a manner that is thoughtful and also including other resilience strategies, not just storm hardening. So we have started to see, I know that Florida Power and Light was, they jumped into action following Sandy, seeing what happened up in the Northeast, and they've since elevated some substations. Still, I think where we've seen not very much action is in terms of incorporating sea level rise. So not just looking about being prepared today and getting up to FEMA 100-year flood hazard zones today, but to look at what's that mean over the useful life of the equipment or building, so over the next 40 to 50 years.
So, great. And related to that, we have a question. What's the status of FEMA currently redoing flood maps to account for changes in sea level?
Yeah, so this was part of the, I believe, the Bigger Waters Act back in 2012, and they've only recently gotten the Technical Mapping Advisory Council really underway. There is an opportunity now. They've been tasked with many ways of considering how to update the standards, including thinking about how they can potentially incorporate sea level rise. I will say, so we'll just, I think, have to stand by and see what comes from that. Following Hurricane Sandy, the sea level rise tool was for Sandy recovery, a great example of various federal agencies coming together. Now, it was not binding. It was used as for informative purposes, but it was a tool that showed what flood hazards could we expect if we incorporate sea level rise over time.
Okay. So this is an interesting question. So do you believe that the necessity for improving resiliency of the system will lead to developing new ideas such as multi-microgrids, which is a concept I'm not familiar with? Is that something you guys are familiar with?
Not really. I mean, unless maybe he's talking about, or they're talking about, connecting multiple, sort of individual microgrids and connecting them in some way, but I haven't heard much about that.
Yeah, me either. So with microgrids, there's another microgrid question. They're saying it comes down to controls and energy storage. And do you have any recommendations as far as energy storage goes in microgrids?
You mean in terms of, I'm not exactly sure what the question is asking, if in terms of different technologies, or?
I would assume so.
We don't really get into sort of specifics about different energy storage technologies. I mean, it seems like, and Seth, you're more of an expert on this, probably, given your recent reports on this, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, sure.
Lithium-ion batteries is one that's obviously advancing pretty fast, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's basically what I was going to say. Most projects that are going in these days are lithium-ion, or some are lithium-ion lead-acid hybrids, because the batteries do different things. Flow batteries are something that people are looking into more and more for these larger, more extended outage conditions, but they're still fairly new technology. So it really seems like lithium-ion is the technology that are people gravitating to more and more these days. So have you looked into the possibility of utilities incorporating mitigation and protection measures into their rate cases?
So this has happened now in New Jersey with PSEG just recently getting approved. They weren't approved for all of the money that they were asking, but they did get a large north of $1 billion approved. And I think where this report kind of comes down is, yes, we should be advancing resilience and increasing resilience, but we do need to make sure that it's being done prudently and it's not just saddling ratepayers with additional cost burdens that probably aren't worth it. This comes down to there are a lot of unsolved problems in terms of how we think about cost-benefit analyses when we're incorporating a range of future risks in areas that we haven't necessarily tried to value yet over time. Con Edison has come out with their approach, and they've been working with numerous collaborators on this. I still think we have many questions still remain to be resolved in this area, though.
I've also heard examples of, in the case of New Orleans, for example, where some investments that they were planning on making, broader than just protecting the electricity grid, but in the levee system and so forth, that was put to a vote by some of the local citizens, and it was rejected because of the cost and because of the amount of cost recovery that would have increased their bills. And so, part of what we say in the report is that not all of this is on the utilities per se, but state regulators, local communities as well, also need to be proactive in developing these solutions along with the utilities. And in the case of New Orleans, they chose not to do it. So, when the next storm hits, they might, the impacts could be greater, but that's something they'll, have to deal with.
Yeah. So looks like we're getting towards the end of our time. We're almost out of time here. I'm just going to do one more question because it's an interesting one that came in, and then we'll wrap things up. We had an attendee from Alaska that said that they're suffering from erosion and climate change effects that are challenging their diesel generator power plants and the resiliency of critical infrastructure facilities in their small villages. So what sorts of things could they be doing to make their islanded systems more resilient?
Well, I'm not entirely sure of the nature of the climate impacts that are causing those problems to the diesel generator systems. I'd be interested in hearing more about that. I'm actually speaking on Friday at a island energy conference here in Maine that's going to have a lot of Alaska people at it too. But I know certainly in Alaska that there are a lot of islanded systems up there, whether they're on islands or on the mainland, but they're remote, so they're effectively islanded. And there has been a lot of progress installing wind projects in particular and diesel wind hybrid systems that the Department of Energy has been working on that are some interesting examples. I'm not that familiar with solar projects, but I do know that And at this conference on Friday, actually, there's somebody from Alaska that's speaking that has incorporated storage into their system as well. So I think on Kodiak Island. So I'll learn more about it there, but there's definitely some examples of the types of systems that we're talking about that have already been deployed there.
Great. So sorry to a few questions that we didn't get to, but we're out of time here. Steve and Julie, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to talk about?
Well, thanks very much.
No, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting, and it's a great report. Again, I encourage everyone to give it a read. And if you have any other questions, you can contact us, or you can reach out to Steve and Julie, and this will all be available online. We'll send out a notice to everyone. Sam, you have any final thoughts for people?
Well, I wanted to let everyone know that we do have a webinar coming up next week on Thursday, November 12th. It is on retrofits for resiliency, how to make an existing solar PV system into an islanded resilient power system. So that might be of interest to a lot of people. You can find more information about that at resilientpower.org. And that is it for our webinar today. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Julie and Steve. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.